Is the clicker working? Yeah, it's just a little.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here, and I'm glad to see so many faces in this particular session, where we're going to really have a panel discuss some of the barriers to advancement for women in community colleges. And Teresa is going to lead the team, and there will be opportunity for you to ask some questions for the last 8 or so minutes of the session, okay?
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one big housekeeping rule. Please make sure that your cell phones are on vibrate because this is live streamed, so we want to make sure that those who are listening in really have no interruption, okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Dr. Teresa Yearout, and I am a PhD doctoral student in the past, and this was a study that came from my dissertation and is relevant, I think, today to all of the issues that the VCCS is facing. I am the coordinator of library services at Southwest Virginia Community College Library, and I am here today with 2 colleagues and mentors, actually, and I'll explain that a bit later because that's a big word in some of the things that are going on in leadership and leadership issues today in the VCCS and in all of our community colleges and state systems. Also, I wanted to tell you that Dr. John Brenner is here from Southwest Virginia Community College as well. He was also on my committee for my dissertation, and he has added the piece today for diversity and gender, looking at a sociological perspective. He is a sociology professor, and he is also our global leader at our college. The second person on our committee and the chair of my dissertation committee is Dr. Mitchell Williams, and he is a ODU associate professor in the Department of Educational Foundations and Leadership, and he is here today looking at the classified settings side of the piece that we did with the research study. So we're looking at the results of our study today, and hopefully we'll make it tie in to some of the issues today in leadership in our state and in lots of states across our nation as far as leadership and women are concerned. So the name of my study is A Study of Women Community College Leaders, Gender and Diversity in Advancement, and we're looking at leadership advancement for women. We are looking at this topic, sorry about that, that's a issue with our program here. But we're looking at the study from a couple of different angles. When I started the study, it was born out of a couple of research projects that I was involved in my coursework. One of them was that I was to interview a leader, and I decided to interview a woman leader on my campus. She was a dean at the time. She eventually became our VP of instruction and my supervisor, and she really inspired me. She is probably one of the greatest cheerleaders of community colleges and community college leadership in the state, I think. And so she gave me buzzwords. She told me about leadership and leadership and transition. She told me about things like how to look at yourself and decide what kind of leader you are. Are you going to be the type of leader that is transformational as she thinks she is? And what mentors will guide you along your pathway if you want to become a leader. So that was one thing that inspired me. Another thing was that I started doing a research project on women leaders. And as I started looking at women community college leaders, I found many positive stories, but also some negative stories that turned into words like barriers and impediments to advancement. And so when I started looking at Dr. Fuller on our campus and what she had told me about leadership, and then looking at some of the barriers, some of which she admitted she faced, many of which she did not. I was curious, and so that led to my investigation then. These were all things that I came up with as I began to read about barriers and impediments to advancement. And so senior level leadership is a big issue. Almost every study that's done on women leaders in community colleges show that there is going to be an impending need for senior level leaders, CEOs, presidents, provosts, all the way down to deans, directors, and you know, all of the managerial positions. Also, that in almost all of those areas, women are underrepresented. They are. I mean, most consistently with the presidents themselves. 36% in I'll show you in a moment, is probably the top number of CEOs that we've had for presidents in community colleges across the nation. That's the highest I've seen. It's usually running somewhere around 27, 29%. So that's less than a third of our community college presidents are women leaders. Also, lack of advancement. Many times women get into positions and they stay there. There's no advancement. They don't go forward. In many cases, in some cases they possibly do, but they get stuck at some point. And then, from all of that information, then what are the perceived impediments? What are the things that women were reporting in interviews, in surveys, all across the board, anywhere that they could respond to the question, what are the barriers? They were stating that there are barriers. There were barriers in the 90s with the glass ceiling. There's barriers today. And then finally, we added the piece looking at classification settings. Much of the research that's being done for community colleges today have added the piece of looking at classification settings. We know in Virginia, we're talking about things like the rural horseshoe community colleges and that kind of thing. So the whole field of study now looks at rural, urban, suburban types of situations in institutions and whether that has a bearing on anything. And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Our study was trying to see if there was a correlation between rural, urban, suburban settings for our community colleges and whether or not that had an impact on women's leadership and their advancement. Just some numbers to throw at you. There have been studies since the 80s with George Vaughan and some other people at the AACC level that have been studying presidents, their salaries, their leadership abilities, or all those things. But one of the questions they almost always ask is, when are you going to retire? And so in the last study in 2015, 80% said they'd retire in 10 years. That's 80% turnover. In the next 10 years, 35% said in the next 5 years I'm going. So that it's kind of interesting, 35% are going, and yet only 35, 36% of our women are leading in those institutions. So, you know, it's interesting to see that we're going to need leaders. It doesn't have to be women. It doesn't have to be minorities. It doesn't have to be diverse. It doesn't have to be any of those things, but we're going to need them. And why shouldn't it be women? Why shouldn't it be minorities? Why shouldn't it be people who are as qualified, perhaps more qualified in some positions than they're given credit for? So these are some of the ideas for underrepresentation. Again, 56% in this study in 2011, women managers, women in supervisory positions and leadership positions, 56%, and that might include some of the presidents. But again, only 36% were CEOs or presidents, provosts, chancellors. So the numbers are there for the positions like deans and VPs and those kinds of things. There's more of those filling in those positions, but certainly still fewer on the presidential side. For lack of advancement, I'll get it out. A couple of things came out, and these are buzzwords that you'll see in the literature, and they're buzzwords you're hearing today. In the 1990s, the word glass ceiling came to be, mostly in businesses and corporations. They used that word. In the last presidential election, we had that word come to the front again. How many times did you hear glass ceiling? And it was a term that was applied to the fact that women could go no higher than a certain level in an institution, a business, or corporation because of some cultural or structural, real or imagined or overt situation within that institution that stopped them, stymied them from progressing any further. So it's still there, it's still working, and it's in education. And then cultural stereotyping. I found this to be interesting. When women enter into organizations, they usually come in to fill a job that's posted, that's available, and they don't come in necessarily in their mindset that they will advance. Now, often they do when they get into an institution. They fill a position that's not really maybe the position that they wanted, or they want to advance, so they go higher, and that's great. But occasionally what they do is they get in that job and they're stuck then. Willingly, unwillingly, but they don't advance for whatever reason. And again, it could be something within the structure of the campus or those kinds of things, but they just don't advance. They may not even have that as a goal until they get there. And then they discover, yes, I could go up. And then they stay at their entry level longer than men do. They come into that position, and then they're stuck there, kind of, because they just don't advance. Men might advance much more quickly up the chain or through the pipeline, if you want to call it pipeline, than women do. Perceived impediments. Perceived was a big word. When I was hashing out, okay, how am I going to put this forward into a cogent idea of research, I decided, along with my chairs, that I would use the word perceived because everyone's perceptions are different. And to be fair, some women will say, no, I didn't have any problems. I just went right up through. I made my way up through, no problems. Others will say, I was stymied at this level because of this. If someone else got the position, I was more qualified. So you'll hear those sort of horror stories too. But Mildred Bullpit sensed, and again, that's a perception word, sensed. She didn't have it in writing, but she sensed that she was denied higher level administrative positions because of her sex. And Mildred was a forerunner in that she headed up the American Association of Women in Community and Junior Colleges. And that was in '75 when she got that position. And so she's been active in that ever since. So she was a forerunner in helping women advance in leadership positions. And she found this to be true in her own experience. And then finally, the classification settings. There is a difference. Dr. Williams will talk about this in a minute, but it's noted in the research that the cultures between rural, suburban, and urban colleges are different. They're different. They've mapped them in lots of different studies on lots of different topics. There is just a difference. And it's a cultural difference. And that's one of the things that I looked at in our study. And amazingly enough to me, because I was a bit shocked by it, organizational impediments on the cultural level were those that scored the highest. That means women thought that the cultures of institutions were the main reason they encountered barriers. And among those, they identified the good old boys network and a culture of power. Still, my study was completed in 2014 by women who were in the system in 11 SAC states, and they're still saying that. So that was the major outcome of looking at culture, looking at classification settings. And all of this is just information about the study itself. I did create my own survey. I created a survey that would look at 24 different impediments. And I grouped those impediments into 3 different subscales. They were personal barriers, they were organizational structural barriers, and they were organizational cultural barriers. So there were 8 items for each one of the types of barriers that they responded to on a barrier scale of not a barrier or not an impediment, all the way up to a very extreme impediment. So that was the basis for the study. I did a validity and reliability check on my survey, and it was approved by a panel of experts in the field of women leadership and gender, and then 5 people from one of the outside states also weighed in on a pilot study. The methodology, again, women leaders. I pulled their names and their email addresses from websites across 11 SAC COC states. That's the southeastern, southern states. And they were the ones that responded. 1,713 names were pulled. Unfortunately, I only had 346 cases that were actually included in the research data, but they came from all of those areas. I looked at demographic questions. Mostly VPs and deans answered, age range 34 to 75. So those were the people that were answering. And those were the things that I asked about: personal, organizational structure, or organizational cultural questions, and then finally the classification setting piece. This was just a table that I pulled from it to show that what I did was I did mean structures and standard deviations for all of the structures. These were the 6 highest mean scores. Again, the good old boys. And culture of power were the highest scoring impediment of all 24 impediments, and the highest scoring cultural impediment. And then, again, this shows the subscales, with cultural subscale being the one that was the most weighty. And that is just introducing the study and how we got to this point. Dr. John Brenner is going to talk about gender findings, dealing with, and diversity findings, dealing with our study and those types of things.
Thank you, Teresa. Well, it takes some nerve, doesn't it, to get up. I look at the room here and I'm thinking, wow, there's an awful lot of women in here. I need to do a statistical analysis to find out how many, what do we have, just a few men. And here I am, okay, I'm going to talk about it. But I am a sociologist, and gender is a topic that I like to talk about anyway. And so I'm going to share with you some of her findings from each one of those 3 categories, and then elaborate on it a little bit more with some other research that we're looking at because of this topic. So in each of the 3 categories, Teresa had 8 components, and we're going to then list the 3 top in each one of them. The first one here, talking about personal and internal impediments. This is something that we could really talk about at great length. There's a lot of research on this, balancing the professional life with the personal life. I remember reading a number of years ago an article by a woman in leadership and who said that she needed a wife. And you always hear these stories about men who talk about, well, behind him was this woman. Well, who's behind the woman in her leadership? And this is a really crucial issue. They talk about tenure kind of problems for women, that a woman who gets a PhD and then, is married, it's right at that period of time when she's trying to get her leadership positions, when perhaps maybe she wants to have a family too. And so I don't think as a society we do as well as maybe some other societies with those kinds of issues of balancing that personal and professional life. Unwillingness to move. How do we hear that all the time? A woman maybe follows the husband. I do know of a woman in leadership whose husband has followed her, and maybe that takes kind of special kinds of guys, and maybe we need to do some things with our socialization about that. Then the idea of isolation and loneliness at the top. Now, part of this will be, and we look at a lot of talk about mentoring. I love to talk to my students about that it's, as a male, you go into an organization, it's not unlikely for an older male to be kind of like a dad to you or a big brother to you. He can take you out maybe and you go play golf or something like that. Now think about that if you're a young, attractive, intelligent woman, who's going to take you under their wing? You see? And it probably, even if the guy wants to, he ain't going to do it. Because there's somebody else who might get upset about it. Because we still have to deal with that issue of gender at that kind of a point. So isolation is there. In the category of perceptions of organizational structure, salary gap, we've looked at that intensely and the like, and it's still, I see sometimes you can go as much as it's 81% of what a man makes or like, but there's still that issue with that gap there. Glass ceiling, I have a lot of fun telling my students about what that is because some of them really think there is this ceiling. It's like, well, where is it? No. But it's, and what it is that in somewhat like my classic example is years ago there used to be like the police department in Los Angeles had a rule said that you wanted to be a male policeman, you had to be 5'10". Well, really what it was a way to keep Hispanics out of those jobs because they have a tendency to be about males about 5'8". Well, we're not looking at that. We're just looking at the structures that take place within an organization. And one thing I think you have to keep in mind about this is a lot of times men aren't doing it intentionally. They just don't know. They just aren't aware. Good example of that is if you talk about poverty and what poverty is, those of us who are not poor, we don't know. And it's like it's really hard to get yourself into that position. So some men don't think about women in leadership because they're not there. We're going to later see, and it's a classic example, what does your board look like? Does the board have women on it, or is it structurally complete there? And then obviously the idea of a double standard. So here's our good old boys, and we don't have the good old girls. Maybe that's what we need or something, but then you would feel people feeling a little bit of an isolation. So the idea of gender gap and the gender roles are there. Women play this really, really interesting game that they have to structure themselves because men might be rewarded for being aggressive and assertive. And then we use other names to describe women who are that way. Right? And I don't have to share those with you. Okay. And so we look at the idea of diversity, gender gap, gender barriers, and the like. If we're saying 57% of our student body is female, where's our leaders? Shouldn't it look the same? And this is, in fact, we had a diversity meeting, and I don't know if some of you were at this meeting in this last October, And all of these are ideas that were presented here at the VCCS, talking about all these concepts about one college and one voice and the like. And our chancellor said, we need faculty and staff that look like our students. Okay? So are we doing that? And so we have to ask the leaders in that kind of a structure if they're there. Now, wanted to share with it just, Teresa found this book and like with From Road, and she just published this book in 2017 and talking about greedy institutions. There's a lot of stuff in the literature anyway with families being greedy towards women and the like. And so now we see this kind of playing out in institutional kinds of things. Unconscious gender bias. And so they look at some women in leadership, and what you find out is that they feel like they have to do even more because they are in that kind of a leadership position. Maybe they've internalized these stereotypes. We have to look at our socialization process that takes place in our society that might give them women there. Here's our concept of maybe, I like that word, maybe assertive or overbearing. Which is one of the words that we would use. Then lack of mentors, underrepresentation on college boards. It's a really crucial thing to look at. Who's on those boards making those decisions and the like, and does it match your population? Women, and especially minority women that are in organizations a lot of times, they get put on all the committees, extra committees and the like, and so it's almost like they have to do double duty within that. The professional and biological clocks, is weird, as I mentioned, they're going on at the same time. We, you know, if we don't have women producing children, we don't have colleges and the like. And so where is our society going to support those people doing those things? This is great. Heidi, you could probably, we talk about this in sociology all the time. Whenever I go to sociological meetings, there's always women sociologists talking about housework. And I always use this prime example is that I have 3 sons. And our house was always clean, and it was me and my sons who cleaned it. Because they'd come home from school and I'd say, we've got to clean the house. And they're like, oh, crap. And so they were very good because they hated it. And so 30 minutes, the house was clean. Nobody would ever walk in that house and say, oh, John and the boys really keep this house clean. They would always make some comment about Patty, my wife. And so, see, it's our society where we have to change those kinds of things. Women have second shift. They're blamed for their children. They're blamed for their housework. They're blamed for the cooking. Okay, now, hey, we gotta change those kinds of things in there. So we need more democratic and the like. And the idea that some women talk about, they're always having to be pleasant. You know, can't have a mood and that sort of thing. We have issues with that, I think, in some cases, okay? And so even the committees that are looking for people and like, we need to show diversity within our committees as we are hiring people within our organizations. Okay, that's my gender piece.
I'm Mitch Williams. I'm from Old Dominion University. I'd like to begin by thanking the 4 men who are in the audience. I think men really need to hear the message that Teresa and John bring today. I'm going to talk very, very briefly because we want to get to your questions and comments. But I'm going to talk very briefly about the setting of the institutions that Teresa looked at in her study. Teresa, John, and I wanted to look at the impediments to women advancement in various settings, urban, suburban, and rural. And each of the 3 of us, I think, kind of have an affinity for rural areas, and we think rural areas have some special challenges for women, but rural areas are where the community colleges are. Other researchers tell us that when you look at community college issues, you really should break the colleges down by institutional setting and size, that there are major differences between community colleges in urban settings and in rural settings. And So Hardy and Katsinas here recommended that researchers and policymakers always break down examinations of community colleges by size and setting. So Teresa wanted to do that in her study. And in the United States today, there are about 1,047 community colleges, but a little over half of them are located in rural areas. Community colleges are a very important educational institution for rural people. As you know, for a lot of rural folks, the choice isn't between a university and a community college. It's a choice between a community college and nothing. So this is an important aspect in the study. And in Teresa's study, the breakdown of the institutions was very similar to the breakdown nationwide. As she said earlier, Teresa looked at the 11 states in the Sacs region, Virginia to Texas, and the breakdown of those, the community colleges within those states reflects the national breakdown on community colleges. The findings from Teresa's study were quite interesting when you break them down by region. Her question was, does the location of the community college, rural, suburban, or urban, affect the perceptions of women leaders on these impediments to leadership? And what she found was that rural leaders perceive that the highest barriers, that rural leaders saw cultural barriers as being highest among all of the types of barriers to leadership. Urban leaders saw personal impediments as being more important to their impediments to their advancement. And suburban leaders scored lower in all three of the settings. Let's look at them just a little bit more carefully. So first of all, leaders from urban community colleges saw personal impediments as being most important. Finding that balance between professional and personal life and having not having a willingness to move. A lot of times people who are at urban community colleges will see a leadership opportunity at a rural college, but they don't want to move to that rural community. Because there are so many more rural community colleges, opportunities come up more often at rural schools than at urban schools. But a lot of folks don't want to move to those rural communities because they perceive the rural community to have fewer opportunities. Could be opportunities for spouses' employment, could be opportunities for their children's educational advancement, whatever. But for urban women leaders, the biggest impediment were the personal impediments. For suburban leaders, they perceive the perceptions in aggregate to have less bearing on their advancement than their urban or rural counterparts. Suburban leaders didn't see as many perceptions to advancement as urban or rural leaders. But rural leaders saw these organizational, cultural impediments as being the most important. They saw the good old boys network. They saw the existence of gender roles on their campuses. There are certain jobs that women could have and certain jobs that women found it very difficult to advance into, kind of the cultural stereotypes that Teresa referred to earlier. And we know that in rural areas suffer from things like lower per capita income, lower employment opportunities, more employment in extraction industries, lower educational attainment, and fewer educational opportunities for young people. And these all added to the impediments that leaders at rural community colleges saw for their advancement. And I appreciate the fact that Teresa was willing to look at these issues, and I appreciated being a part of her study, and we are eager to get to move forward onto your your questions and comments, and I think Teresa has some concluding remarks, and then we'll be eager to hear from you.
Just very quickly, as the takeaway, and you think of, okay, what can a study that we prepared and completed and provided some results do for the people in the VCCS, women leaders who are hoping to advance, women leaders who are thinking about maybe going into a doctoral program or even a master's program to help them advance in positions. Because again, once again, they might get in a position in a college and say, I can do that job, I can do that job, I can do that job, but I need some credentialing, or I need something, mentorship, or something that will help get me up through those other stages of advancement. So there are things that we can take away from these ideas. 22% of our VCCS presidents are women. Yesterday, with Germana adding another woman leader to their presidential role, we now have 6 of the 23 colleges having women leaders. And that probably is starting to kind of play into the average numbers of women leaders, but obviously much room. And as we are losing presidents across the state, I mean, there's other presidential searches going on, there are women who are being considered for those positions as well. And we never want to think, I was hired because I'm a woman. You know, that can happen too. When you're looking at hiring and promotional practices and those kinds of things. The general rule is women are the ones who look at men advancing more quickly than they do. But I don't think any woman wants to think I was put into a position because I'm a woman either. I want to be put into a position because I am certified, qualified, and prepared to take on a position, and I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. And that has nothing to do with gender or diversity or anything else. So those are just some numbers. But we still have, for instance, just in general, a 22% gap in pay for women, between men and women. And this is a new number that came out in Virginia. And it puts us as not education, not just in education, obviously, but across the state, we're the 35th worst state for a gender gap in pay. And that bleeds over into education as well. But some findings then, very quickly, for practitioners and leaders in the VCCS nationally, wherever community colleges exist and reside. There are some practices that need to be put in place that are suggested by the results of our study. They should look at programs for professional development. I went through ODU and received my doctoral degree. There are other degrees in community college leadership that are out there, but look toward, they need to provide in-house professional development. They need to encourage people to get higher certifications and diplomas and degrees. So within the leadership of our colleges, there's a role that they can take. They should be putting women forth. They should be putting men forth. They should be putting qualified people forth and getting them to higher positions. We should also, again, recognize mentoring and role models. That's important. Dr. Barbara Fuller at my college was my mentor and encouraged me in my program as she interviewed with me, and that was a push that I appreciated. And guard against overt and underlying cultural differences that you see from institution to institution. Be aware, if you're advancing, culture makes a difference, obviously. It will make a difference. And again, if you don't want to travel to a rural community college to live, to work, to exist, take that into consideration. I mean, it is cold, hard facts kind of sometimes that you really have to look at the institution. And I know that's difficult. If you're coming in and trying for a position, it's, you know, you're an outsider. You won't know the inside things that go on within a culture, but be aware that they're probably there, according to these women leaders. They're there. You've got to be on the lookout for them. So those are some things that leaders and practitioners can help with. Hiring committees, selection committees, those need to be well-rounded. They need to be versed in all the federal, state system, and institutional policies, and they need to follow them. They need to practice those policies and keep them in place so that they are in compliance with all of those. The days when we say our campus is not ready for a woman leader, our campus is not ready for a minority leader, our campus is not ready. And those words can still be heard on campuses, in hiring committees, outside of hiring committees.
Okay, we have exactly 2 minutes left in our session, so.
We'll get to questions, okay? And then finally, just for you, these are just some things for you, and I've already said these things. Be aware. Know that these stereotypes exist, these cultural differences exist, these setting differences exist, and that's what you could be up against as you're applying, either within your institution, outside of your institution, but they're there. Be aware of them and make them work for you as you advance, as you attain other certifications, or just if you're thinking about it. Know those things. Take the positive from what looks like an otherwise negative aspect to our culture. Okay?
We have one question.
I was just wondering if, did you find any sort of perception by the women who were responding that other women who were already in positions of power were holding them down?
Throughout ages, yes, and John knows plenty about this, but yes, there were. And most of that came, not so much that I could tell as far as my quantitative study went, but there's plenty of other studies out there that involved interviewing leaders, and yes, they say that. And a couple of those, that new book that John was speaking about and did some of his slides on Road, she talked about that. The fact that women held women back. You know, it's a territorial thing. It's a, you know, I don't know what all goes into that mix. But women don't trust women. They don't trust them to be good leaders. You know, they don't trust them to be mentors sometimes.
The internal socialization process.
So, yes, it's there,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much.
No, oh,
Sorry, we're out of town.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you.
45 minutes goes really fast.
Yeah. If nothing else, it's a good conversation starter to kind of talk about.
It is. It brings up the topic and gets people to talk about it, to think about it, and then to review it.